Hello and welcome to my movie channel. Some of you may recognise me, I do have a couple of other channels on here, but if you are completely new to me then hello. What I'm aiming to do with this channel is to talk about films basically, as it is a subject that I've been fascinated in for a very long time. So for my first video I decided to talk about my top 10 films of the 60s, and this is going to be done in two parts. So this part will be the first 5 and then the second part will be the other 5. Now, I'm not going to begin chronologically with the 60s, I will go into earlier decades as well, but I just thought the 60s was a nice decade to start off with. Now, I'm going to go through this list chronologically, so from 1960 to 1969, or closest to those years, mainly because I don't really feel the need to rate these films as such. I think they're individual films in their own right. So I really hope you enjoy watching. So the first film I'm going to talk about is this one. I guess you could call it a psychological thriller. It's called Peeping Tom and was directed by Michael Powell, a British director, and was released in the early summer of 1960. Basically, it follows the story of a young man named Mark Lewis, who was a photographer who had quite a troubled childhood, as he was constantly the subject of his father's tormenting psychoanalytical experiments based on the whole concept of fear. And this has nurtured Mark, if that's the word, to become a serial killer. And he kills his victims in a very unique way. He approaches them with a long metal spike and films them as he's killing them, as he is literally obsessed with capturing the most terrifying moment any human can experience, the moments when we know that we're going to die. Now, most monster films often portray the monster as the typical bad guy, in that he or she or it is bad because he or she or it is just bad. What is terrifyingly good about Peeping Tom is that how Michael Powell gets deep down into the recesses of the subconscious of a psychopath. We are forced to get into this maniac's brain, and it's very hard to come out of it. And we are forced to see why exactly he does what he does, even if we don't really want to know. In fact, we, the viewers, see each murder through the crosshairs of a viewfinder. So is that suggesting that we are the Peeping Toms as well? Now, another aspect of the film I found quite fascinating is its sort of cult status. It was not well received at all when it was released. It was slammed by critics, and many have quoted in saying this was the film that destroyed Michael Powell's career. It was actually quite a surprising jump for Powell, as his previous films had been a little bit nicer, we should say. So this film may not be for everyone. It is quite extreme, but it is well ahead of its time, and in terms of storyline, I don't think you're going to find any too similar. So that's Peeping Tom. The next film I'm going to talk about is Psycho. And I guess you could call this Hitchcock's baby, as he was determined to make this his best movie, and he wanted the twist to hit his audiences hard. And there are actually a number of ways that he achieved this. First of all, he actually bought the rights to the novel written by Robert Bloch, and in a way sort of boycotted it to prevent people from buying the novel, reading it and finding out the twist. Secondly, with each screening of Psycho, he prevented anyone to leave or enter once the film had begun. And thirdly, from a cast and crew point of view, he made them all sign a contract not to spread a word about the film, and he even went to extremes of keeping the last few pages of the script to himself and wouldn't show it to them until the actual shooting day. The plot basically follows a young, attractive woman called Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, and she steals some money, and she's on the run, and she stops off at the Bates Motel, run by the quiet and quirky and strangely handsome Norman Bates, perfectly played by Anthony Perkins, who seems to have his life controlled by his dominating mother. We know that she is present because we can hear her voice, but we don't actually see her. Now, it isn't long before we realise that something not quite right is going on, and we find out just how ugly things are when Janet Leigh takes that infamous shower. Now, the shower scene is probably one of the most famous scenes in cinematic history. It involved 90 shots and took over a week to film, but even with its time-consuming shooting schedule and the gory nature of it, the scene only lasts for 45 seconds, and out of those 90 shots, Only 2 do you see a knife, and not once do you see a penetration. I guess it's the classic example of it's what you don't see that's the scariest. Now this was actually Hitchcock's last black and white film. Now it was quite surprising for him to go into black and white because a couple of his recent films had been in colour. For example, if you look at North by Northwest and Rear Window. But he actually intentionally made it black and white for a number of reasons. Firstly, he felt the film would be too gory in colour, and secondly, he wanted to see if he could make a black and white slasher movie that wouldn't be typecast as the horror B-movies that had gone before. One of the things that I admire about Alfred Hitchcock is the way he relates his films to the real world. For example, with Psycho, he actually made Janet Leigh wear store-bought clothes instead of giving her a fancy wardrobe, which many actresses had in those days and still do. And also, in this film, this is the first time you'll ever see a toilet flushing on screen. Now, as most films beforehand would have used a prop, the fact that Hitchcock actually specifically had the toilet flushing on screen shows that, oh, it must be a real toilet, it must be in a real motel, this must be real. It actually did receive lukewarm reviews when it first came out, probably because of the shocking nature of it, but it has grown to be probably one of the most influential horror films of all time, and I personally think Hitchcock's hard work paid off. It's a perfect example of a suspense film, and it made us forget that the monster of a film doesn't have to be this grotesque boogeyman, and it can just be the nice guy next door. So that's Psycho. The third film I'm going to talk about is slightly nicer than the other 2. It's this one. It's The Apartment, directed by Billy Wilder and starring the ever-lovable Jack Lemmon. Basically, it follows the story of Bud Baxter, played by Jack Lemmon, who has the American dream of being at the top, and he lends out his tiny little apartment to meet the needs of philandering executives, and evidently bribing his way up the career ladder. Meanwhile, he eyes the pretty elevator girl Fran, played by Shirley MacLaine. So he tries to win her over, but the problem is she's actually the mistress of his seedy but already married boss, Mr. Seldrake, played by Fred MacMurray. So at the end of the day, he's faced with the ultimate guy's dilemma: lose your job or lose your girl. Now, The Apartment is like a mixture of different genres, so from satirical and romantic comedy to quite a bleak drama. But even with these clash of genres, it doesn't seem too heavy. For example, the relationship between Bud and Fran does form the romantic comedy side of it, but it isn't too soppy. There isn't really much to say about this film as with the other 2, because it's a really lovely film, and it was, unlike the other 2, it was really well received from the start off. In fact, it won 5 Academy Awards and even won Best Picture. And actually, it was the last black and white film to win a Best Picture Oscar. Well, I should say the last pure black and white film, because I suppose you could count Schindler's List, but Schindler's List did have a couple of colour scenes in it. So this is the last purely black and white film to win Best Picture Oscar. So yeah, even though it does delve into the bleak and dark aspects of the work ethics in America in the 60s, it's just a lovely, bittersweet film. That's The Apartment. The next film I'm going to talk about is The Innocents. It was directed by Jack Clayton and starred the beautiful English Rose, Deborah Carr, and was based on the short story by Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. The film follows the story of a vicar's daughter, played by Carr, who takes up the role of a governess for 2 orphaned children. They seem like little angels to begin with, but she soon becomes suspicious of their ever-increasing mature behaviour, and even goes as far as to convince herself that they may have been possessed by the ghosts of the previous governess and her sadistic lover. Now, this film has some of the most beautiful cinematography and lighting that I have ever seen. For example, the water scene where the young Miss Giddens sees the ghost of Miss Jessel in the reeds, whom of which little Flora seems to be completely unaware of. It perfectly captures the creepy atmosphere, and it really does show that you don't need blood and guts to have a real good effect. The film also presents the classic viewer dilemma of are they or aren't they? In fact, even the tagline itself questions this, and it's do the dead ever return to possess the living? So even when the film finishes, we are still plagued with the questions: was it really haunted? Are they really possessed? Or is it just the troubled mind of a emotionally and I suppose sexually repressed young woman? So I think this film is beautiful, and despite it lacking in any real violence or horror, if you like, it still manages to have a great effect, and it's really chilling in most parts. And brilliant performances by Deborah Carr and the young Martin Stevens, who played the young boy Miles. So that's film number 4. Now, jealousy is quite a powerful emotion, particularly between two siblings. My 5th film is Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. It was released in Halloween of 1962 and was directed by Robert Aldrich. The plot basically follows two movie star sisters who have both had their share of the limelight. Jane, played by Bette Davis, was a successful child star, while Blanche, played by Joan Crawford, stole the limelight from her sister in the later years. So it is clear that there is some rivalry brewing between the two. And then one night Blanche is actually left paraplegic from an accident. But was it really an accident, and who caused it? That's the question. Now, this film does feel quite claustrophobic, and I suppose in a figurative sense, as Blanche feels she has been completely overpowered by her mentally unstable sister. Now, it has quite interesting, but I suppose in a way genius casting of Davis and Crawford, because they were rivals in real life. I mean, they hated each other from the 30s. I mean, why they decided to appear together in this film, I'm not sure. Maybe it may have been jealousy of the other trying to steal the limelight. I suppose like the sisters in the film, I suppose. And they really did not need to hide their rivalry on screen and off screen, as they actually played quite a few practical jokes on each other just to annoy each other. For example, Bette Davis actually had a Coca-Cola machine installed onto the set because Joan and her husband were actually spokespersons for the Pepsi company, so Coca-Cola's biggest rival. And also Joan would actually fill her pockets with rocks so that Betty would strain her back when she was dragging Joan across the floor. Now, Bette Davis is brilliant in this film, and she also had a real input to the film, not just to Jane but to the film as a whole as well. For example, it was her idea to have the film made in black and white. It was originally going to be in colour, but she suggested to Robert Aldrich that she thought that colour would be too cutesy and too pretty. She also decided to sort of deliberately overreact, as she felt that Jane would be delusionally, plagued with the acting bug. So this film it's quite dark, but it's filled with fun, nasty moments. So I guess you could describe it as a bleak and grotesque horror comedy. But I like it, and if you haven't seen it, I'd check it out. So thanks for watching part 1, and part 2 will be coming up soon. Bye bye!